At 23 years old, Eliza stood on the sidewalk with nothing but a rain-soaked cardboard box and a mountain of debt that felt like an anchor dragging her to the bottom of the ocean. Her parents were gone. Their family library was sold to the highest bidder in a cold, sterile auction room just months prior. With the last dollar she owned, a crumpled bill she found in the pocket of an old winter coat, she did something the world called a fever dream. A ruined, abandoned bookstore on the edge of a fog-drenched Oregon town from a stranger on Craigslist. The listing had no photos. It simply said, Thorne's Ink and Echoes, $1. Must take everything inside, including the ghosts. When she arrived, the local shopkeepers didn't hide their laughter. The building was a skeletal structure of rotting cedar. Its windows were clouded with decades of grime. Like a tomb than a place of business. You bought a bonfire, kid. An old fisherman barked from across the street. The roof is a sieve. The floor is a trap. And the books inside aren't worth the match it would take to light them. Eliza didn't argue. She only felt the weight of the heavy brass key in her palm. A key that felt strangely warm, as if it had its own pulse. She stepped toward a door. Her boots sank into the mud of the unpaved alley. But what nobody in that town knew was that behind a false wall of crumbling plaster lay a secret. Tucked into a shelf that hadn't seen the light of day for 50 years, was a document that would rewrite the history of American literature. It would transform a girl with a broken spirit into the guardian of a fortune beyond belief. Before we continue, if stories about the hidden magic in forgotten places mean something to you, hit subscribe. Tell us in the comments below. Have you ever found an old object that felt like it was waiting specifically for you? We love hearing how these echoes of the past find their way into your lives. The fog rolled in from the Pacific like a thick gray curtain. It swallowed the street behind her. It isolated the shop from the rest of the world. The air was heavy with the smell of bitter salt and wet earth. The wood of the door was swollen with moisture. It resisted the turn of the key. Eliza leaned her shoulder against the grain. She pushed with the strength of someone who had nowhere else to turn. The wood groaned in protest. Then the lock snapped back with a sharp metallic crack. She stepped across the threshold. The sound of the mocking laughter from the street vanished instantly. Inside, the air was still. It smelled of old leather, dried vanilla, and the sharp tang of cedar. It was the scent of 1,000 stories held in suspended animation. She closed the door behind her. She turned the deadbolt. She was alone in the dark. Maybe it was the way the fog felt like a shield. Maybe it was the way the wood smelled of second chances. Maybe it was the way she finally felt invisible in a good way. She didn't reach for a light switch. She knew there was no power here. Instead, she pulled a small flashlight from her pocket. The beam cut through the gloom like a needle. It illuminated mountains of paper. Shelves groaned under the weight of thousands of volumes. The ghosts the ad mentioned were everywhere. They weren't spirits of the dead. They were the physical remnants of an unfinished life. A pair of spectacles sat on a stack of ledgers. A half-empty tin of pipe tobacco rested on a stool. A bookmark was still tucked into the middle of a novel. Everything looked as if the previous owner had just stepped out for a moment. But that moment had lasted for half a century. Eliza reached out and touched the spine of a book near the door. It was the first edition of a collection of poems. The dust on its cover was thick as felt. It didn't feel like a ruin. It felt like a sanctuary. She realized then that she wasn't just a buyer. She was a rescuer. She set her cardboard box on the floor. She sat down on a stack of magazines. The silence of the building was profound. It was the first time in months she could hear herself breathe. The world had taken her home. The world had taken her family. But for $1, she had bought a fortress of ink. She gripped her flashlight. She noticed something strange on the floor. There were no footprints in the dust except her own. Not even the man who sold it to her seemed to have walked through these aisles. She stood up and walked deeper into the labyrinth. The shelves grew taller. The ceiling disappeared into the shadows. She reached the back of the room. Something caught her eye. A small red light was blinking. It was buried deep within a stack of old maritime charts. It was a modern device, a GPS tracker. Someone had been here, and they were still watching the shop. The red light of the GPS tracker continued to pulse in the corner of her vision. It felt like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her. She stood frozen for a long minute. Her breath came out in a thin, white plume of mist. She slowly reached into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against a small, stiff piece of paper. It was a receipt she had carried since the day of the final auction. She pulled it out and smoothed it against her thigh. The ink was faded purple. It was dated December 14th, 1998. At the top, the letterhead read, Thorne's Ink and Echoes. Her father's name was written at the bottom in his elegant, flowing script. Below it, the title of the purchase, The Heart of the Horizon, Special Edition. She remembered that book. It was the only one he never allowed her to touch. He had kept it in a velvet-lined case on the highest shelf of his study. Eliza closed her eyes and could still smell him. The library of her youth was a cathedral of knowledge. High windows allowed shafts of Oregon's sun to illuminate the dust like gold leaf. Her father was a man of quiet passions and heavy silences. He didn't just read books, he listened to them. He taught her that a story is a living thing that changes every time it is read. But the cathedral had been built on a foundation of sand. The medical bills began as a trickle, then they became a flood. She watched her father's hands begin to tremble. She watched the light leave her mother's eyes. Then came the bankruptcy. Then came the funeral. Then came the men in the grey suits with their clipboards. They moved through the library like vultures. They didn't see the memories of a daughter. They only saw assets to be liquidated. She stood on the sidewalk as the moving trucks took the shelves. The sound of the auctioneer's gavel was a death knell. "Sold!" he shouted over and over. The word felt like a physical blow to her chest. Loss is not a hole in your life. It is a heavy, suffocating presence that sits in the room with you. She was left with $300 and a box of old clothes, and a memory of a receipt found in an old suit jacket. She looked at the bookstore around her now. It was the twin of her father's lost dream. Rain began to drum on the roof above. It was a soft, rhythmic sound at first. Then it grew into a heavy, relentless roar. Water began to drip from the ceiling in the far corner. It ran down the walls in dark, jagged lines. It looked as if the house itself were finally crying for all it had lost. Eliza didn't move to stop the leaks. She didn't have the tools. Instead, she dragged 3 old burlap sacks to the center of the room. She piled them together to form a crude bed. She sat down and pulled a thermos of cold coffee from her box. The taste was stale and bitter. It reminded her of the nights spent in hospital waiting rooms. The silence of the shop grew heavier with the rain. Books are the only things that don't leave you when you stop paying for them. They wait in the dark. They hold their secrets until you are ready to hear them. Silence can be a sanctuary if you are hiding, but it can be a prison if you are waiting for a voice that will never come. She reached out and turned the GPS tracker over in her hand. The plastic was cold and cheap. The red light blinked again. Who was looking for Thorne's shop? Was it the same people who had taken her father's library? She tucked the device under a stack of old newspapers. She lay down on the burlap sacks. The floorboards were hard and unforgiving. The air grew colder as the night deepened. She pulled her old winter coat tight around her shoulders. She felt the silver receipt against her skin. Her father had traveled hundreds of miles to buy one book from this shop. He had never told her why. He had never mentioned Thomas Thorne. She looked up at the ceiling. The rafters were thick with cobwebs and history. Maybe the walls were listening to her thoughts. Maybe they were judging her. She fell into a shallow, restless sleep. She dreamed of a house that was made of paper. It was burning. She was trying to catch the pages as they flew into the sky, but they turned to ash before she could touch them. She woke up with a start. A loud crack echoed from the back of the shop. It wasn't the rain. It was the sound of wood splintering. Someone was trying to open the back window. The shadow at the back window retreated into the thick Oregon mist. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood in the absolute dark for an hour, listening to the house settle. The old wood expanded and contracted with the dropping temperature. It sounded like a slow, deep, ragged breath. She realized the building was holding its breath. It was waiting for a reason to finally let it out. The moon climbed higher, eventually piercing through the heavy coastal fog. A single silver beam cut through a jagged hole in the roof. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the center of the room. They looked like tiny floating stars in a vast wooden galaxy. Eliza followed the light, her boots silent on the burlap sacks. She noticed the bookshelves didn't just line the perimeter of the walls. They formed a complex, tight spiral that led towards the heart of the shop. The shelves were made of ancient oak, dark and polished by millions of human touches. They stood like silent sentinels guarding a forbidden, ink-stained temple. She reached out a trembling hand to a nearby volume. It was bound in deep blue silk, frayed and delicate at the edges. There was no title on the spine. Only a single word was handwritten in white ink. Longing. She pulled it out and opened it to a random page. The pages were blank, yet they smelled intensely of summer rain and old letters. She moved her flashlight to the next shelf. The word written here was joy. This shelf was located near the front window, where the morning light would be strongest. The books here felt strangely warmer to her touch. She understood the hidden twist of the shop now. Thomas Thorne hadn't organized these books by name, author, or date. He had organized them by the emotional weight the stories carried within. He had mapped the human soul using nothing but paper and animal glue. Eliza began to walk the narrow aisles, reading the faded labels. Betrayal, wonder, solitude. She felt a strange, sudden sense of belonging. She wasn't just a girl in a ruined shop anymore. She was a living part of a larger, grand architecture of human feeling. She rested her forehead against a shelf labelled Hope. The wood felt smooth and cool against her skin. She whispered to the dark corners, "We are going to be okay." The house seemed to creak a soft, rhythmic response. A house is a museum of the choices we have made throughout our lives. Dust is just time that has decided to sit down and rest. She began to categorize the damage to the building as if it were a physical wound. She touched the peeling wallpaper and promised the house she would mend it. She looked at the black mold in the far corner like a cancer to be removed. She wasn't just a tenant or a buyer. She was a caretaker of a dying legacy. But as she turned back toward her makeshift burlap bed, she saw a gap. In the mystery section, a single thick book was missing from the shelf. The gap was perfectly clean and free of any debris. The dust had been wiped away very recently. The thief who broke the window hadn't wanted her money. They had come to take a very specific story from the collection. She gripped her flashlight tighter as the wind began to howl. The silence was no longer a sanctuary. It was an invitation for the next intruder to arrive. At dawn, the Oregon sun did not rise so much as it bled through the grey horizon. The light was thin and cold, revealing the true scale of the battle Eliza had inherited. She didn't cry when she saw the extent of the rot in the morning light. She simply rolled up her sleeves. She reached into her rain-soaked box and pulled out the only weapons she had left. A gallon of white vinegar, a box of baking soda, a soft, bristled boar hair brush her father had used for his rarest folios. The bookstore was a patient on an operating table. The mold was a black, velvet-like cancer eating its way through the cedar studs and the silk-bound spines. She started with the walls, scrubbing in slow, deliberate circles. The pungent smell of vinegar soon filled the air. It clashed with the stale scent of salt and the heavy, damp aroma of decay. The mixture burned her throat. It made her eyes water until she could barely see the grain of the wood. But to Eliza, it was the smell of life returning to a dead place. She spent the first 6 hours on her knees. She scrubbed the floorboards until her knuckles were raw and stained grey. She used a micro spatula to gently pry apart pages fused together by decades of coastal humidity. She remembered her father's voice, a ghost whispering in the dusty corners of her mind. "Never use force on a page that is trying to hold its breath," he would say. She obeyed him now. She placed sheets of acid-free blotting paper between the damp leaves of a poetry collection. She used a weighted glass block to flatten warped covers that had curled like dead leaves. She moved to the mystery section, where the intruder had been the night before. The gap on the shelf haunted her. She reached for a massive leather-bound copy of Moby Dick that had fallen behind the cabinet. It was heavy and cold. The leather was cracked like the skin of an ancient, weathered whale. As she opened it to check for foxing, she felt a hard lump near the spine. It wasn't a pressed flower. It wasn't a forgotten letter from a lover. She pulled out a second GPS tracker. This one was different from the first. It was smaller, more expensive, and the plastic felt slightly warm to the touch. It was broadcasting her location at this very second. She stood up and looked out the front window. The old fisherman was sitting on a pier mending a net. He wasn't looking at the ocean. He was staring directly at her door. She realized the town's mockery was a layer of camouflage. They weren't laughing because she was a fool. They were laughing because they thought she wouldn't survive long enough to find what was hidden. She tucked the tracker into the center of a hollowed-out dictionary. She set the dictionary on a shelf near the back door. Then she went back to her work. She spent 14 hours that day in the war against the mold. The air slowly began to clear. The smell of rot retreated, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of lemon oil and vinegar. The grit of decades of dust settled on her skin like a second layer of clothing. The rhythmic shush of her brush became the heartbeat of the building. Every stroke was a promise. Every cleaned shelf was a territory reclaimed from the dark. Restoration is an act of supreme forgiveness. You are telling an object that its past neglect does not define its future value. She realized she was talking to herself as much as the books. Hard work is the only prayer that always receives an answer from the universe. She didn't need a miracle. She needed a steady hand and a clear mind. As the sun began to dip below the waves, she reached the section labeled Regret. She pulled a small black ledger from the bottom shelf. It was the only book in the entire store that was locked with a silver clasp. She tried the brass key from her pocket. It didn't fit. She heard a soft metallic click from the front door. Someone was trying the handle. Eliza held her breath as the door handle rattled one last time before falling silent. She stood in the center of the shop, a shadow among shadows, until the footsteps on the gravel retreated toward the pier. Safety was a temporary currency in this town. She turned her attention back to the wall in the corner labeled Regret. The plaster here was bloated and soft from a century of salt-laden humidity. She picked up a small masonry hammer. Every strike sent a shockwave through her raw knuckles. Chunks of grey lime fell to the floor like heavy, dry snow. She worked with the focus of a woman trying to exhume her own past. Maybe it was the way the dust tasted of lime and forgotten winters. Maybe it was the way the hammer felt like an extension of her own frustration. Maybe it was the way she finally felt she was breaking through the silence. She reached the section where the massive oak shelving was bolted into the studs. She tapped the hammer against the wood. Clack, clack, thump. The sound changed. The frequency dropped from a V-solid strike to a deep, hollow vibration. It was a secret hidden in the acoustics of the architecture. Eliza moved to a dusty box she had found in the healing aisle earlier that afternoon. Inside, beneath a stack of anatomical diagrams, lay an old Littmann stethoscope. The metal was cold against her fingers as she adjusted the earpieces. She pressed the diaphragm of the instrument against the dark oak panel. She tapped again, this time with the pad of her thumb. The sound in her ears was deafening, a booming echo that whispered of a void behind the wood. Secrets have a different frequency than the lies we tell ourselves to survive the day. She traced the grain of the wood with her flashlight. The oak panels were book-matched, mirrored so perfectly that the seams disappeared into the natural swirls of the timber. This wasn't an accident of construction. This was a masterpiece of concealment. Sometimes you have to break the surface of things to see if the heart is still beating inside. The sunset began to bleed through the high, grime-streaked windows. The room transformed into a cathedral of deep, liquid amber. The dust motes looked like sparks from a fire that had been burning for 50 years. She realized the truth is always hidden behind the very things we are most afraid to touch. She looked at the small black ledger she had found earlier. The silver clasp caught the dying light, mocking her lack of a key. She pressed her ear back to the stethoscope. Deep within the wall, she heard something that made her blood turn to ice. A faint, rhythmic clicking. The house wasn't just holding its breath. It was a mechanism, ticking toward an appointment she wasn't sure she was ready to keep. She looked at the regret shelf and noticed a small circular indentation in the wood. It was the exact size of her father's old silver pocket watch. She reached into her books and pulled out the watch. It was still frozen at the moment of his death. She pressed the face of the watch into the indentation. The clicking inside the wall stopped. A heavy, motorized hum began to vibrate through the floorboards. The shelf didn't move, but the air in the room suddenly grew 10 degrees colder. The smell of ozone and old electricity filled the space. She heard the sound of a heavy bolt sliding back. The regret shelf began to recede into the wall. The shelf was only 6 inches into the wall when the sky above the Pacific turned a bruised, electric black. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into the building with the force of a tidal wave. The cedar siding of the bookstore shrieked as the storm began its assault in earnest. The motorized hum behind the regret shelf flickered, sputtered, and then died with a sickening mechanical grind. Eliza lunged for the gap, her fingers clawing at the wood, but the mechanism was jammed tight. The silence that followed within the room was broken by a terrifying crack from directly above her head. One of the main rafters was buckling under the weight of the rain pooling on the flat section of the roof. Rain began to pour through the ceiling, not in drips, but in heavy grey curtains. The water hit the floorboards and splashed instantly onto the lower shelves of the solitude section. She saw the ink beginning to bleed on a rare collection of letters, the blue lines turning into ghostly smears. The sight of the melting words felt like a physical knife twisted into her gut. She looked at the jammed oak panel, then at the sagging ceiling that threatened to bury her alive. Destruction is sometimes the only way to facilitate a true and lasting rebirth. She ran to her box and grabbed the heavy iron crowbar she had used to pry up the floorboards. The metal was freezing, biting into the raw, sensitive skin of her palms. She tasted copper in the back of her throat, the unmistakable metallic flavor of raw fear. She didn't hesitate for a second. She swung the bar with a primal, desperate energy she didn't know she possessed. The iron bit into the book-matched oak with a high-pitched, splintering scream. The wood was unexpectedly thick, reinforced from the inside with hidden layers of steel mesh. Fear is a compass, pointing directly toward the action that is most necessary for survival. Another rafter snapped above the joy section, sending a shower of plaster and glass across the floor. The ocean's roar outside grew so loud it seemed to be vibrating inside her very skull. Eliza wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam and threw the entire weight of her body against it. Her feet slipped on the wet, slick floorboards, but she refused to let go. She was fighting for the books that had been her only friends. She was fighting for the secret her father had died trying to protect. She was fighting to prove that she was more than the sum of her losses. We are never as strong as when we have absolutely nothing left to lose but our next breath. The oak panel finally gave way with a thunderous sound like a gunshot. She tumbled forward into a space that felt strangely pressurized and perfectly dry. Behind her, a massive section of the bookstore's roof finally collapsed. The mystery section was buried instantly in a heap of timber, rubble, and freezing rain. The air in this hidden chamber smelled of dry ozone and ancient, undisturbed dust. She scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving as she wiped the rain from her eyes. She turned her flashlight toward the darkness that stretched ahead of her. The beam hit a surface that wasn't wood, plaster, or stone. It was a vault door made of solid, heavily polished copper. The copper was etched with the same spiral pattern she had seen in the arrangement of the bookshelves. There was no handle, no keypad, and no obvious way to open it. But in the center of the spiral was a small, rectangular slot. It was the exact size of the silver-clasped ledger she had found in the regret section. Eliza reached into the ruins of the shop, pulling the ledger from where it had fallen. She slid the book into the copper door. The storm outside raged, but inside the wall, a different kind of power was waking up. The copper door didn't slide or swing. It dissolved into the floor like a sinking sun. The silence inside the chamber was a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. It was a vacuum of history, preserved at a constant temperature by the very earth beneath the shop. The air here was different from the rot and salt of the outside world. It tasted of ancient parchment, dried lavender, and the faintest hint of ozone. Her flashlight beam felt too aggressive for this room. It cut through a darkness that had been comfortable for decades. In the center of the small, pressurized room sat a single wooden chest. It was made of dark, unvarnished walnut. Eliza knelt on the floor, her wet clothes steaming slightly in the dry air of the vault. She noticed a mercury-driven humidity gauge on the wall. The needle was still perfectly calibrated, hovering over the ideal mark. Whoever built this understood the logic of systems better than anyone she had ever known. They had built a fortress for the fragile. She reached for the lid of the walnut chest. The hinges were made of silk and bone, making no sound as they moved. Inside, wrapped in layers of acid-free tissue paper, lay a stack of handwritten pages. The title page was written in a hand that looked like dancing ink. The Last Echo. Eliza's breath hitched in her throat. This was the legendary unfinished masterpiece of Julian Vane. The literary world believed the ending had been burned in a fit of madness in 1972. But here it sat, pristine, complete, and waiting for a reader. She touched the top page with a trembling finger. The paper was cool and felt like high-quality linen. As she lifted the first chapter, a thin, stiff slip of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a stock certificate for International Business Machines. It was dated 1964. Then another slip fell out, and another. They were original shares of IBM and Xerox, issued before the great tech booms of the 20th century. She looked at the numbers and the dates. These shares had undergone dozens of splits over the last 50 years. They weren't just bookmarks. They were a financial engine that had been running in silence for half a century. A single bookmark was now worth more than the entire town of Thorne's Harbour. True wealth is rarely about the numbers in a bank account. It is about the tools we leave behind for others to build something higher than themselves. Gold is heavy and invites greed, but a legacy of words and shared vision is weightless. It is the only thing that can truly carry us through the storm. The quietest moments of discovery are always the loudest in the echo chamber of our memory. Eliza felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest, ignoring the chill of her wet skin. She moved her light to the bottom of the chest. She noticed a small black and white photograph tucked behind the manuscript. It was her father as a young man. He was standing right here in this very vault. Beside him was a man with a wild beard and kind eyes, Thomas Thorne. They were both smiling, their arms draped over each other's shoulders. Her father had been here. He had seen the last echo with his own eyes. He had known about the bookmarks and the copper door. Why had he never told her? Why had he allowed the grey suits to take his library if he had access to this? She turned the photograph over. There was a third person in the picture, but their face had been carefully cut out with a razor. Only a pair of gloved hands remained on the edge of the frame. She looked back at the GPS tracker she had found earlier. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The people watching the shop weren't looking for the money. They were looking for the person in the photograph who no longer had a face. She heard a soft thud from the ruins of the mystery section. Someone was digging through the rubble. The digging sound in the rubble above grew more frantic, vibrating through the copper walls of the vault. Eliza didn't panic. She reached to the very bottom of the walnut chest, her fingers brushing against the heavy, wax-sealed envelope. The wax was a deep midnight blue, stamped with the signet of an anchor entwined with a vine. She ignored the intruders and the collapsing world outside, focusing entirely on the rhythmic scratching of her own name on the parchment. To Eliza Vance, the handwriting read. It was the same sharp, slanted hand that had addressed the vault. She pulled a small silver penknife from her pocket, a tool her father had used to sharpen his pencils every morning of her childhood. The blade was sharp and cold. She sliced through the blue wax with a steady hand. The smell of warm beeswax and ancient cedar drifted up from the paper as the seal broke. A single candle she had lit and placed on the corner of the chest flickered, its flame dancing in the still air. The morning sun finally began to pierce through the jagged gaps in the roof of the shop above. Thin, golden needles of light filtered down into the vault, illuminating the dust motes like a halo around her head. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a heavy, dripping silence. The rustle of the letter in her hands was the only sound in the world. My dearest Eliza, the letter began. If you are reading this, the death has finally come for the Vance family, and the library is no more. You are likely wondering why your father, Arthur, never spoke of me, or why he allowed the men in grey suits to take his treasures. The truth is that I am not just a stranger from Craigslist. I am Thomas Thorne, your grandfather's younger brother, the one the family tried to erase from the ledgers. Eliza's breath caught, and a single tear escaped, blurring the ink on the word family. Your father and I were more than student and mentor. We were co-conspirators in a grand preservation. He knew that the world would eventually try to liquidate his soul to pay for his survival. So, we built this vault as a time-release safety net, a fortress that would only open for a heart that had been broken and then mended by its own labor. He didn't tell you because he knew you had to earn this place just as he did. Family is not just a matter of shared blood. It is a shared secret, a commitment to a legacy that the world cannot understand or tax. She looked up at the broken roof, watching the light change from silver to a deep, rich gold. We are all walking on paths that were cleared by people who loved us in silence, long before we were even born. They moved the stones so we wouldn't trip, and they planted trees so we would have shade we didn't deserve. Forgiveness is the final, most difficult step of any journey, especially when you realize the person you resented was actually your greatest protector. Eliza touched the cut-out face in the photograph, her finger tracing the empty space where her great-uncle's features should have been. She understood now why the face was gone. Thomas had erased himself to ensure that the Thorne curse of debt would never find this room. He had become a ghost so that she could become a guardian. She folded the letter carefully, placing it inside her father's silver watch case. The scratching in the rubble above stopped. A shadow fell over the opening of the vault.